Hi there. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the introduction to some inflation concepts that relate to ideas about the long-run implications of using policy. The first half of this stuff here is mostly a review, so I'm going to go through it relatively quickly and be like, hey, if you don't remember that, go back and check this stuff out. A stupid, goofy cartoon here. Inflation, prices rise faster than your income. Oh my goodness. Deflation, prices fall, but you don't have any income. So that's kind of the sneaky part. Let's talk at the beginning about what this inflation is. Two models of inflation. We can talk about something called Keynesian price levels and classical price levels. And really the easiest way to understand them, I think, is in two graphs. So the graph that's below is the Keynesian model. And that's suggesting that you have a short run aggregate supply curve that basically is an upward sloping line. So we have LRAS and YF and aggregate demand and a short run aggregate supply. And if aggregate demand goes up, then we see a little boost in output, right? We see prices go up, and then in the long run, SRAS shifts back to the left, and we go from point A, sorry, you can't really see my point A right there, it's covered up, from point A to point B to point C, right? So at the end of the day, yes, it results in higher price levels, but this short run aggregate supply means that like basically producers can ramp up production in response to higher kind of aggregate demand, and that we'll get a little bit more production. But then in the long run, the kind of workers and the input folks will realize, oh yeah, I got to raise my prices and I need higher wages, and the SRAS curve will shift back to the left. That's a really good model for short run time periods. So like if you're looking at like what happens if the amount of aggregate demand changes in just a short period of time, you might get a little bit of increase in overall output. And it's a good model for if this price level change is relatively is moderate, right? If you go from like 2% to 3% inflation. But there is the older model that actually Keynes kind of said that it was incomplete, and that is the classical model. And the classical model suggests that there is just one aggregate supply curve, and that the LRAS equals the SRAS, that there isn't like a short run or a long run, that they're both just vertical lines. And so we have YF, and if we have a situation where aggregate demand rises, right, and it just boosts like that, then we don't really go from point A to point B, we go directly from A to C, and prices just get higher. And so we never get that increase in output. And in fact, that really models fairly well the long run, because that's just, you skip this intermediary step and you say, well, in response to this, if there's nothing else that changes, there's just going to be higher prices. This also models really nicely countries where the inflation rate's very high, because if the inflation rate's really high, then producers aren't going to be able to go from point A to point B, because their workers will instantaneously recognize that the inflation rate is getting higher and higher, and their workers are going to be constantly saying, boss, give me a raise. The suppliers who are supplying the inputs are going to say, you're going to have to pay higher and higher prices. And so the AD1 happens basically at the same moment that SRAS shifts over to SRAS2. And so the countries with very high inflation, they don't experience this kind of movement from A to B to C. They just go whoop from A to C. And where that shows up, here's an example of Zimbabwe, where the money supply was rising at very high rates of change, and the consumer price index basically tracked with it, suggesting that basically they were increasing the money supply and they weren't getting any changes in output. It was just, like do not pass go directly to jail, right? Go directly to inflation jail is what was happening here. Now, when we talk about the different causes of inflation, there are really three ones to be familiar with. There's aggregate demand caused inflation, right? And that's the kind of inflation we go from A to B. And we have a fancy name, we call that demand pull, because the demand is pulling up the inflation rate, right? It's kind of pulling it up from A to B, from that incremental to that point. And then the second type of inflation is caused by decreases in short run aggregate supply. So what we saw from B to C. And we sometimes call that cost push, because the costs are pushing up the prices of everything else in the economy. It's kind of saying like, what's the main driver behind the higher prices? Is it more demand that's pulling the prices up, or is it costs that are of production are pushing prices up? There's a third cause of inflation called the quantity theory that we're going to learn about in the next section. I didn't even include it on this slide deck, but it's called the quantity theory of money, and it equates like movements. It's proportionally movements in the money supply to price levels, which we actually just saw with Zimbabwe. Now, review here really quickly, effects of inflation. There's immediate costs. You know, we talked shoe leather, menu, unit of account. You got to know those. We got the inflation tax that we talked about in the last unit, where it erodes the value of people's savings. It's not directly imposed, right? It's not like the government coming in and taking your money, but it erodes the value of your savings with higher inflation. The monetizing the debt temptation to just print money to pay the debt, that's bad, right? We talked about that in the last section. We also know that another cost of inflation is that it reduces SRAS, which limits economic growth. At the end of the day, aggregate supply increasing is what's going to cause economic growth. And so if it's more expensive to produce, you're limiting that process. A couple of other review terms. These are from Unit 6, way back when, right? I told you this unit is really putting the puzzle pieces together. This is disinflation, is the process of reducing inflation rates. Deflation is the negative price level change. So I'm going to, again, go through those relatively quickly. Now, the last part is new stuff. This is called the Phillips Curve model. So I'm going to slow down a little bit here, say new, pay attention. This shows up on the AP test much more often than it probably should, given its current role in economics. Is actually a lot of economists today are like, maybe the Phillips curve is not even a real thing. Like, so just understand that what I'm about to teach you, the current profession of economics is like, I don't know about this thing. So let's go. I'm going to teach you the orthodox party line, and then we'll kind of explore later about maybe why it's not particularly a useful model for us. But right now, we got to learn how to crawl before we walk, before we run. So if you look at this picture below me, these are the relationship between inflation rates and unemployment rates in Britain in the 1950s and 1960s. There was a man named A.W. Phillips who basically pulled this data and plotted it. And was just this was the earliest point really in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was when economics was starting to go, you know what might be helpful is looking at data. Like before the 60s, graphs and data and stuff like that were not really a big part of economics. I know that sounds crazy, but like if we pull out John Maynard Keynes's books, there aren't graphs in them. They really don't. I mean, there's a handful, but they're not really there as the main entree. So this was kind of new at the time. We plotted those points, and I'll kind of do what I do in class, which is to say, what do you notice about the relationship between those, right? Ignoring all of this stuff over here, you could maybe win the same Nobel Prize that A.W. Phillips did, which is he said, yeah, you know, I kind of see a relationship. He went, yeah, if you kind of squint a little bit, you go, yeah, all the points, they're kind of inversely related. Now that's a stretch, right? But it's an interesting stretch. And he called it a Phillips curve. And so we can call it unemployment percent, or you can use the word rate. You don't need to put both percent and rate. That would be silly. So just one of the two. And you put inflation percent or rate is fine. You do need the word rate or the percentage here. You can't just put unemployment. You can't just put inflation, because you need something to indicate that it's actually the rate of change. So it's like the percent change from a year ago in the case of the inflation rate, or it's the current percentage for the unemployment rate. So what he noticed was, if you plot those points and you become an economist and you say, I'm just going to make it into a straight line, is that there's kind of a inverse relationship here, that we expect that when there's very low unemployment, there's typically higher inflation rates, and vice versa. When there's very high unemployment, there's usually very low inflation rates. Now, by the 1970s and 80s, economists were like looking at more of this data, and they plotted way more of these points, and they noticed that it just turned into like a big mess. And basically all the points started like dots, basically showed up on the same graph. But what they started doing is they just started showing up like right in the same area. Like it never got really below 3, and it never really got above 8 very often in terms of unemployment. But like the inflation was all over the map. And so they noticed in the long run that there isn't really a relationship between these two variables, but there probably is to some extent in the short run. Now, that's a caveat, like probably is, maybe, because in the last 10 years, in the United States at least, there really isn't. There's no real relationship that we can even observe in a short run. So there's a lot of open questions about, like, is this model even particularly helpful for us? But we're gonna, you at least have to hear about it to be able to understand, like, maybe all of the debates around this. So they constructed in the 80s, different economists, this one was named, the two of them, Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman, who became extremely famous economists for their research into monetary theory, which we'll talk about later. They basically said there's a long run Phillips curve, and it's just that. That there's some unemployment rate in the economy that just exists, and that the unemployment rate kind of gravitates back toward. And they used the research about the natural rate of unemployment, and they said that that natural rate of unemployment kind of corresponds to this unemployment rate that the economy wants to come back to. And they called this unemployment rate NAIRU. Now, for our purposes, we can equate it with the natural rate, which we remember is structural plus frictional unemployment, right? Remember that that's what that is. And this is the unemployment rate that the economy kind of naturally tacks back toward if we're at long run equilibrium. So we just say maybe 5%. And so they basically observed that this unemployment rate is where the economy kind of ticks back to. And what they called this NAIRU was the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And that's like a mouthful. But what it's basically saying is that if the unemployment rate is, instead of being 5, if the unemployment rate is 7, that you are not at the current level of the NAIRU, right? That's obvious because you're at 7 instead of 5. And so inflation will accelerate. And it will accelerate from wherever it was. Like I didn't give you numbers here, but if you start to move down this way in terms of the unemployment rate, if you're moving up in unemployment, we would expect the inflation rate to accelerate, and it will accelerate down, right? So I'm using the word accelerate not instead of decelerate because that's not a real word. But thinking about NAIRU again, if you fell below NAIRU, like in the sense of like you had 3% unemployment and the economy was hot, then you would expect inflation to also accelerate, but it would accelerate upward in the sense of going up. And so they noticed that basically if you were anywhere on this NAIRU, inflation was going to stay where it was, wherever it was. So maybe, if your economy was at NAIRU and you were at 5% unemployment, this number here could be 25% or it could be 2%, right? Didn't really matter, but they noticed that if you're at NAIRU, then your inflation rate's basically going to stay the same. And they noticed that if you go above the NAIRU, then your inflation rate will fall. And if you go below the NAIRU, right, from 5 to 3, for example, your inflation rate will rise from wherever it was before. Now, that's a really interesting kind of connection points that we can start making here. The first connection point is to long-run equilibrium, like in the sense of the output model. So if we said you've got this picture of price levels and unemployment, and you said aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and then you have LRAS. So if you were at, right, like point A here, and you're at full employment, that corresponds to point A right there, right? So that's one of the ideas. Another one is to say that if you're like way out here and you have like way bigger amounts of output, right? Bigger amounts of output would be a large amount of kind of production. That's going to be low unemployment rates, right? It's going to be a low unemployment rate and a relatively higher inflation rate. And likewise, if you had really kind of low amounts of output, then that would be high unemployment rates. So it's kind of a mirror image almost. And we're going to learn kind of a little bit more about that mirror image and how that works here very soon. But this is what we would call a recession, right? So if you were ever asked on a test, draw the model and label a recession, it would just be here. This would be equilibrium, and this would be an expansion. Again, we're going to explore this model in a little bit more detail later, but that gets you everything you need to know to be successful for the first practice problem set. So good luck. See you next time.